All right, 2 videos in one day. I'm wearing the same shirt and everything. So here we are. We did electoral process last time. Now we're talking about formal powers of the president, and for while we're at it, the vice president. The vice president's duties. The vice president's job is almost not talked about at all in the Constitution. So basically, the vice president takes over when the president dies, and that's about it. The only thing mentioned in the Constitution is that the vice president gets to vote in the Senate in the case of a tie. So if there's a 50-50 tie, the vice president can come over and vote to be the tie-breaking vote. Otherwise, the vice president doesn't get to do anything. The vice president, of course, is the president of the Senate, but no one cares because no vice president really goes there to monitor the Senate because it's boring. Very, very boring. If you have any questions about that, feel free to watch C-SPAN and watch Senate debates anytime you want. Qualifications. The vice president needs to be 35 years old, needs to be qualified to be president. So 35 years old, vice president needs to be lived in the country for 14 years and a natural-born citizen. The vice president must also not be from the same state as the president. That is a technicality in the rules. Okay, I think it's important to note that the vice presidency, it's not that important of a job. I mean, it's a big deal. People want the job, but there are no official responsibilities. You could do nothing, or you could do a lot. Probably the most powerful vice president in U.S. history was Dick Cheney under George W. Bush. But other vice presidents have complained of boredom. For example, Nance Garner, who was FDR's vice president, though before that he was the Speaker of the House, who went from being very powerful, said that a vice presidency wasn't worth a bucket of warm, and then it rhymed with spit. And that was Nance Garner's feelings on the vice presidency. Okay. The expressed powers of the presidency, or the formal powers. On the AP exam, they frequently ask what the formal powers of Congress are, what the formal powers of the presidency are. You need to know the formal powers. And the good news is we've covered a lot of these things on this slide already because the executive branch in many ways is a repeat of the legislative branch. So the president gets to make appointments. The president appoints judges. And the president appoints ambassadors. The president also appoints cabinet members. Judges, ambassadors, and cabinet members must all be approved by the Senate, and they need a majority vote of the Senate. Although sometimes this is filibustered to prevent these judicial nominees from being approved. All right, so ambassadors. Basically, ambassadors often is a political reward. Like, you worked really hard on my campaign, so you get a cushy job being the ambassador to some Caribbean island. Or you're the ambassador to somewhere in Western Europe, because who doesn't? I mean, well, people don't want to live in Western Europe, but you get to have an expense account, you get to be important. You'll notice that those are the two hotspots for political, like, I did you a favor, so now all of a sudden you are the ambassador to France. Even though you don't speak French, and no one, I mean, basically people want to live in those places. Whereas if you look at South America, you look at Africa, the Middle East, those, and Central Asia as well, where it has no political appointees, this is the total number of ambassadors, by the way, that were political appointees in U.S. history. So essentially, it is, at least I assume it's U.S. history. I think it's from the chart. Point being is that some of our ambassadors are career diplomats, the ones that go to Central Asia, the Middle East. But the ones that are going to nicer locales, then they are political appointees. And it's kind of a reward you get for raising money for the president. All right. The president is also able to convene Congress. If the president wants to call a special section of Congress to talk about, let's say, a budget crisis or something like that, he can order the Congress to come back over the winter holiday, the Christmas holiday. And there's nothing about that, and that says specifically in the Constitution that the president can call Congress into session. Laws. I mean, this again we covered already in the legislative branch. So we're talking about the president can sign a bill into law if it passes Congress. The president can veto a law, meaning the president can say that I reject the law. And then Congress would have to have a 2/3 vote in both houses to get the law approved. He could pocket veto it, which means that he doesn't sign it, he refuses to sign it, and if after 10 days Congress is no longer in session, then the bill is effectively vetoed. A line item veto was something that President Bill Clinton had. It was a power that basically let him veto just parts of bills, but that was declared unconstitutional in Clinton versus New York. It is no longer a power of the presidency because it gives the president lawmaking powers, and that is the role of the legislative branch. And the executive order is an implied power. Basically, the president can issue an order to tell the federal bureaucracy what to do. He is the head of the federal bureaucracy. Thus, it's logical that he can order them to do things. And we can take a look at executive orders in a moment. As you can see, executive orders are quite common among the presidencies. Kennedy averaged about 76, Clinton averaged 46 a year. Obviously, it depends on how many terms people served. Kennedy didn't serve a full term, so he didn't issue as many executive orders in total. But they're very common. Some examples of executive orders are that the President Truman integrated the military by ordering it to happen. And he basically said we're no longer having a segregated military. He's the commander-in-chief, so he just ordered them to integrate. And President Truman is allowed to do that, but the next president, if the president wanted to, could override that executive order. And they could override it because then Truman isn't the president anymore. That didn't happen, but it is a distinct possibility. Of course, the Supreme Court can also declare executive orders unconstitutional as well. All right, treaties. Again, this is stuff we've talked about already in the legislative unit, but the president makes treaties with foreign nations. Now, the Senate has to approve it with a 2/3 vote. Without a 2/3 vote, the treaty cannot be a treaty. What has happened a few times is that when Senate won't approve a treaty, the president instead makes an executive agreement. And in that case, the president takes the treaty that Senate wouldn't approve, signs it, and says, look, we have an executive agreement, and let's say it's disposing of nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. You can do that, and you might need money to fund that, but as long as Congress gets a majority vote to approve the funding in the House and the Senate, all of a sudden you have an executive agreement. If the executive agreement requires no money, then you just make one. And the president, this is an implied power of the presidency. It is not a formal power. That makes it an informal power. You must know the differences between these two. Commander-in-chief is another formal power. The president is the head of the military. That allows the president to send troops to different places, and it is an incredibly powerful, it's very significant power is a better way to say it. All right, pardons, commutations, and reprieves. These are mentioned in the Constitution. A pardon is basically declaring someone no longer guilty of a crime. So you can pardon someone and they are released from jail, or maybe they are accused of a crime and they're just pardoned so they never go to jail. A commutation is basically cutting short someone's prison sentence, but they still remain guilty. So they're guilty, and they have that felony on the record, for example, but they never went to jail. And a reprieve is just postponing a jail sentence. All right. There are also several informal powers of the presidency that you need to know. The president is considered the chief diplomat. That means that the president goes, abroad, he talks with other nations, he represents the United States, and basically it's kind of suggested because it says that he can make treaties that imply that he's allowed to do this. He also says he can grant and receive ambassadors, which is the same concept. So he is the chief diplomat. Yes, the Secretary of State is the nation's diplomat, but the president outranks the Secretary of State. So obviously that is the case. Obviously that is, I mean, that's just kind of inherently obvious. So the president outranks the Secretary of State. So if this president wants to do diplomacy by his or herself, totally allowed to. Doesn't need to rely on the Secretary of State. Chief legislator. This is a role that maybe was best taken up by FDR. Basically, the president can suggest legislation. Every year, the president issues a State of the Union address. This is mentioned in the Constitution. The president has to issue a State of the Union address. He can do a speech, or Thomas Jefferson was apparently afraid to speak in public, so he just wrote a letter, but whatever. You can, either way, a State of the Union must be given. In the State of the Union, the president generally outlines what the president believes the nation should focus on, specifically that the legislative branch should follow the president's agenda. Is the legislative branch required to do that? Absolutely not. But because of the bully pulpit, which is basically the idea that the president can get media attention whenever he wants. So if he announces a press conference and he says, why isn't the legislative branch, why isn't Congress getting things done? It puts pressure on Congress. Because if you're a representative, you can't call media attention and get national media time. Even if you're a senator, you can't necessarily do that. But the president can do that anytime. And this is kind of one of the powers of the presidency. And finally, the chief Democrat and chief Republican, when the president, like President Obama is the chief Democrat, President W. Bush was the chief Republican, you become the unofficial head of the party because you have the most powerful job in the land. So basically, people are following your lead, and you become responsible for the party. There is a head of the Democratic and Republican Party, but when there is a head of the Democratic Party now, but no one cares who it is because President Obama is the head of the party. If by chance you're watching this recording in 2017 and there's a Republican president, well, I recorded this a while ago. Anyway, imperial presidency we're actually going to talk about in one of the next videos. So do not worry. But if you have any other questions, please let me know and make sure that you ask them in class. All right. Again, ask me questions. See ya.